Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Timperley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. Welcome to edition 103 of the Food Safety Fridays webinar program. It's nice to have you along for today's session, which is experiences with HACCP systems, strengths and weaknesses in practice, and that'll be with Cor Grandveld from FSSC 22000. We'll be meeting Cor shortly. Just a few bits and bobs first. Yep. Type in the sidebar, say hello, get to know each other, tell us where you're from. Save your questions till the end, otherwise they sort of get lost. So when we invite you to ask your question, just save them up if you can until the end. Just to say, this webinar program that we bring to you, regular sort of short bursts of education, you get a free certificate of attendance. It's sponsored by our kind sponsors, AIB International, DNV GL Business Assurance, Metal of Toledo, Trace Analytics and Safe Food 360, our friends who support us. Yes, I think that is it. Oh, there's one other thing. In the sidebar, you'll see we've got a training course next Friday, practical internal auditor training. If you have to do internal audits, that's very helpful. 4-hour training course, very practical tools, and you'll get some documents and templates and things like that. So you can check that out in the sidebar. All right, I'd like to introduce you to Cor now. Are you there, Cor?
Yes, I am, Simon. Hi.
Can you switch your webcam on?
Yes, please, I can.
Okie dokie. Boom. Hi, Cor.
Hi, Simon.
Nice to see you again. Can you tell the audience where you're calling in from today, Cor?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I see all names and countries from all around the world, so I'm very happy that I can connect and talk to you. I'm calling from the Netherlands, Simon. I'm based in the Netherlands, and that's why I have such a strange name, Groenveld, but you can translate it in English to Greenfield, eh?
Very nice. And whereabouts in Holland? I didn't ask you, Cor, actually.
Exactly in the middle. It's the fruit area. We grow a lot of fruit in the Netherlands. It's a small country village next to the biggest river in Holland, the Rhine. And when I walk out of the street, I can just walk to the river. So it's a very nice area in Holland.
Very nice. Thanks for that, Cor. Right, okay, I'll get your slides on. There we go. We'll switch our webcams off, and I'll be back for the Q&A later. I'll leave it to you, Cor.
Thank you very much. And again, a very warm welcome to this webinar. And I'm very happy that you joined this. You take the effort and time to listen and look at the presentation. First of all, short introduction. As said, I'm Cor. I'm working for FSSC 22000. It's one of the GFSI recognized certification programs. And before that, I worked almost for 25 years for a global certification body. And yeah, in that position and the current position, I witnessed a lot of different food safety systems, but also I visited a lot of countries and saw a lot of food safety management systems. So what I like to share some experiences from myself, but also from FSSC 22000. And I hope these best practices and experiences can help you in your continuous journey to make food safer. 3 topics today: a short introduction on FSSC 22000, and then what I call the 5 steps to ensure an effective HACCP system. Yeah, it's not possible in 45 minutes to give you a training or an education in how to ensure an effective system, but I hope a number of experiences can support you. And then also a short introduction on food safety systems for small organizations, because I think this is a global topic that is very important. A huge number of food organizations are small or medium and have less developed food safety systems. So I like to speak a few words how we can support these organizations. First of all, FSSC 22000, perhaps you're familiar with them, but it's a global certification program and it was developed in the Netherlands. And specifically on FSSC 22000 is that it doesn't write their own standard, but we use independent international standards. And most of the standards come from ISO. There's a non-profit foundation that owns it. So we really like to make sure that all the money is spent very carefully. And we invest the money that we earn in the program again to make sure to improve it and make it continuously better. Recognized by the Global Food Safety Initiative, GFSI. That is the organization started, I think, 15 years ago. The large global retailers and manufacturers decided together to make a benchmark model to recognize food safety programs, certification programs. And FSSC 22000 is one of the recognized ones since a long time. Very important is to ensure that certification audits are reliable and that certificates are reliable. And therefore, FSSC 22000 has a robust integrity program that makes sure the rules are clear for the certification bodies, but there is also a monitoring and review system of these certification bodies to ensure they do their job correctly. And there's a huge number of large manufacturers and retailers who accept FSSC 22000. And what we are seeing now is that also there is a growing acceptance by food authorities. We see that, for instance, in the cooperation with the FDA in the US, where we have a close connection when you talk about FISMA, but also in Europe, in Belgium and in the Netherlands and France, we see that food authorities are starting to accept third-party certification and private standards more in their job to ensure that food companies are inspected and approved. Just some figures without going in detail. These are the numbers that shows the size of FSSC. As you can see, more than 18,000 certificates, 110 certification bodies with 1,500 auditors and active in 154 countries. A few names, because I think it always helps to see what is the acceptance of a certification program. And I'm sure you recognize these names of the organizations that are using it. There are much more, but just to give you a flavor. How does the scheme works? And that is also important before I start with talking about an effective food safety management system. What you see here is that the basis of FSSC is ISO 22000, thus the global standard for food safety management systems. On top of that, there is also a requirement for prerequisite programs. And again, FSSC 22000 uses international technical specifications like the ISO 22002 series, in which the prerequisite programs for specific sectors are defined. And then there are a number of additional requirements because it is important to be flexible and dynamic. And sometimes there are developments in the world where FSSC wants to have additional requirements. One of them is a requirement to have a food fraud mitigation program. I come back to that later. So these are the three building blocks for FSSC 22000 certification. And these are the documents that organizations need to meet. Then there's also an additional voluntary module. We call it the quality management module. And that's based on ISO 9001. That's not mandatory, but organizations can have an integrated food safety and quality system when they meet also that part. The supply chain, what you see here is the scope of FSSC 22000, and you see that there are a number of technical specifications with sector-specific requirements for prerequisite programs, again, international standards, and also these standards are mandatory for the sectors in which organizations are active. So they need also to meet those requirements. And there's catering, there is manufacturing of products, there's transport and storage, retail. So in almost all the sectors of the food supply chain, FSSC 22000 is applicable. That is just a short introduction. The next part is the 5 steps to ensure an effective HACCP system. What you can see here is the experiences we have from practice on an effective HACCP system. And I like to do this by 5 steps. First of all, we believe that to have an effective HACCP system, you need to embed it, you need to integrate it into a management system. And I give some more explanation later. So we always say start with building a management system. That is the first step, what is good for an organization. Then, of course, you need to have your prerequisite programs in place. That is the basis also, if you look at Codex, the general hygiene principles. First step for HACCP is to start with the prerequisite programs. And so make sure that you develop and implement them, and again, integrate them in that management system. Another important step is, of course, the hazard analysis. And again, Codex has a good description of it. But also when you look at ISO 22000, there are a lot of good requirements on how to conduct a robust hazard analysis. And I think that is the heart of every HACCP system, of every food safety management system. After that, you can create a HACCP plan to identify the control measures for the significant hazards, and also how to monitor and take corrective actions when necessary, and integrate that again in that management system. And last but not least, nothing is 100%, nothing is perfect. If I knew how to develop a perfect food safety management systems, I would not sitting here doing this webinar. I think I would be on a very nice tropical island and never had to work again. Nothing is 100%, but we need to learn from things that go wrong, and therefore performance evaluation and continuous improvement is a very important step and a very important element of a food safety management system. Step 1, the management system. I cannot describe all the requirements for that, but what I try to do is just to give you some topics of which we see and experience that these are important elements of an effective management system. But first of all, it starts with the top management. It starts with leadership. So requirements and also implementing good leadership, engagement and commitment of top management is essential for an effective food safety management system. Next one, you need to understand what the requirements are of your interested parties. And interested parties is obviously your clients and the consumers. But there are much more. It can be the food authorities, it can be your suppliers, it can be NGOs. And what is very important is to identify those interested parties and to define their requirements. If you do not know their requirements, how can you ensure that your system is working? What are the risks and opportunities you have as an organization related to food safety? What is happening in the world? What is happening in your sector? What can go wrong? And I think it's not only doing the risk analysis for food safety hazards, but it's also looking as an organization to what's happening in the world and what can influence you. And not only risks, but also opportunities you have that will also help you to continuously improve your system and make sure that the system is better. Policy objectives. What is your direction? Where do you want to go as an organization? What do you want to achieve? And it starts with policy, but you need to translate your policy in measurable objectives. Use the SMART principle for that. Without measurable objectives on food safety, it's very difficult, perhaps even impossible, to make sure that your system works. And everything in an organization can be defined as a process. So a process-based approach is very important and helps. So what are the processes in your organization? Not only the manufacturing or service processes, but also the supporting processes that are very important. Internal and external communication. Make sure that you define and implement very carefully how you communicate internally. Change management control is an example of that. Changes are risks, and things that an organization does the same every day, most of the time you can have a good control of that. But when things change, then you have a high risk. How do we communicate changes? How do we make sure that the food safety team knows about changes and can make sure that they adjust or modify the food safety system? But also external communication. Make sure that you have systems in place for that. not only how to communicate with interested parties like your clients, but also if there is things going wrong. So when things go wrong, how do we know who we need to inform? And how can we arrange that we control any problems with food safety externally? Without resources, you have nothing. So make sure that you have sufficient resources, that you identify what you need. Resources are qualified people, but also machines, also utilities, all kinds of resources that you need to ensure that your processes can work effectively. And supply chain and vendor assurance. I think the supply chain approach is critical with food safety. You can have your own organization, your own processes perfectly controlled, but when you do not understand your supply chain, when it is not transparent for you where your raw materials come from, how can you control them? So make sure that your supply chain is transparent, upstream and downstream. Also, when you provide products to your clients, things can go wrong. You can have problems in your supply chain with transport or storage or distribution activities. So identify your supply chain and also make sure you have a very robust vendor assurance program. Often a weak spot in organizations, that's my experience. When we do not control our suppliers, we have huge risks. And that's not easy, I can tell you. But you need to do things like a material risk assessment, looking at services that you buy, looking at your activities that you subcontract to others. So when you have co-manufacturing or you have co-packing, make sure you control it. It's very critical. And then, as I said, nothing is 100%, but things can go wrong. So control of non-conforming products. So when things go wrong, how do we ensure that the risks is mitigated and that we know where our products are and that we know how to get them back from the market? But also when we have non-conforming products in our own facilities, how do we control them? How do we make sure they do not end up in our supply chain? Performance evaluation of processes and system. First of all, we want to see that our processes are effective, but also we want to see if the whole system is effective. The verification of the effectiveness of the system is a very strong tool. Doing analysis on information, on data, looking at our customer complaints, looking at analysis of our finished products, looking at our internal audits. Do we see trends? Do we see that things are starting to get wrong? And that all helps us to take good decisions and identify actions to make the system better. A corrective action process, come back to that later too. Also not an easy process for a lot of organizations, but the most important element of this is when things go wrong, that we do a very good root cause analysis. Make sure that we find the real root, the root cause. That's the only way that we can prevent goes wrong again. And sometimes for organizations that's not easy. We need to train our people in this. It's a technique and it's not always an easy one. And in the end, continuous improvement. So just a list of topics of which we see that strong food safety management system cover, and make sure that you look at your own system and see if you have implemented that. I'm a strong believer in ISO 22000. The reason for that is that the elements that I showed you in this previous slide are all covered by this standard. And also because this standard is developed by an independent organization, the International Standardization Organization. And I just showed you the content of the standard. And as you perhaps know, the original standard was from 2005. And in this year, in June, ISO has published a revised version for the first time. So after 13 years, we have a revised version. And I must say that changes that have been made, I think they're very strong. I was member of the ISO committee, so I supported the modification process. And of course, there's always things that can be even better, but I think we made a great step forward in the changes that we did. The requirements for food organizations start in chapter 4 until chapter 10. So there you find the requirements for a food organization. The second step is to develop and implement previctory programs and integrate them in the management system. Again, when you look at the requirements for that, first of all, it's good to understand what is a previctory program. Because sometimes terminology is not the same, explanation is not the same around the world. That's what I experience a lot. So make sure we have the same terminology and understanding of these things. And I think on that time definitions come in, and I don't like definitions. I think it's not always the nicest part of a standard, but it helps us to standardize and to speak the same language around the world. And most important from a previctory program is that it's talking about basic conditions and activities to maintain food safety. They are supporting a food safety management system. It's all about having good facilities, having good processes, have good general cleaning systems in place. Make sure that hygiene is on the right level, that you have a supplier program. So it's all the basic conditions that you need before you even start doing your hazard analysis. And that's why it's a previctory program. It needs to be in place before. Well, we have good documents that can support us in that. We have, of course, the general principles of food hygiene already from 1969 with some amendments. And I think that's a great basis. And also, yeah, it's a standardized approach because, as you know, Codex is a global governmental organization. The food authorities are a member of that. And I think we speak Codex HACCP language all over the world. And even in a lot of legislation, Codex HACCP is mandatory, like the European food law. And also you see that in other countries. Then we have also documents under ISO 22000. First of all, ISO 22000 itself has a chapter 8.2, and it says the organization shall have PRPs. So that's the general requirements that an organization needs to define them and implement them. But to have all the prerequisite program requirements of the whole food supply chain in one document, that's not easy. And that's why ISO decided to have the ISO 22002 series. And in there, you find requirements for sector-specific prerequisite programs. I showed you already the scope of FSSC 22000, and FSSC 22000 requires one of these technical specifications for the applicable sector. Here you see in detail what are these different technical specifications. Most of them are in the 22002 series. You can see the different sectors on your screen. A number of them are not yet ISO standards. In the bottom of this slide, you see also the PAS 221. And that's a public available specification. That's a national standard developed in the UK by BSI. And there's also one for transport and storage. And that is a Dutch standard from NEN. That's the Dutch Standardization Organization. These national standards normally will be input for ISO. It happened also with some other technical specifications. And it's the idea that they will migrate into an ISO 22002 document. And there's already a working group in ISO that is working on the prerequisites for transport and storage. And there is the objective to have also an ISO 22002 document on that. And then the national standards will disappear. So you see, for almost the whole food supply chain, you can find a sector-specific requirements document on prerequisite programs. And to give you an idea, again, without going in detail, but this is one of those technical specifications, the 22002 Part 1. That's how they call them. And I just put the content of this document on the screen. And that's not rocket science when you have knowledge of HACCP and food. What you see is that most of the requirements come directly from the general principles of food hygiene of Codex. And a few of them you will not find. Chapter 17 and 18, for instance. Chapter 17 is about product information, information on labels, consumer awareness, and chapter 18 is about food defense. These requirements you will not directly find in the Codex principles, but they are already in the ISO 22002. There's also now a discussion about food fraud, for instance. That is not covered at the moment in this document, but is a very actual requirement in the food supply chain and very critical. So perhaps in the next revision, we will also find food fraud in this document. And food fraud and food defense, there's a lot of discussion about it. If you know the Global Food Safety Initiative, I talked about them in the beginning, the organization that is benchmarking and approving or recognizing food safety certification programs, they require a food fraud and food defense approach. And I think this is a nice slide. I took it from one of the GFSI conferences. And you can see here how they see food fraud and food defense. The unintentional adulteration is on the food safety and food quality side. And the intentional adulteration, there you find food fraud and food defense. And one of them is, of course, economically driven, and the other is more ideologically driven. Most important is that organizations need to do analysis. They need to do a threat analysis, or they need to do a vulnerability assessment analysis to see what are the risks towards food fraud and food defense, and if there are any significant risks, how do we control them? And that is also a requirement in FSSC 22000. I talked about the three elements of FSSC, and one of them I said are the additional requirements on top of ISO 22000 and the applicable sector-specific document for prediction programs. Well, this is the third part I talked about, the additional requirements. And here you find additional requirements, for instance, for food defense and food fraud. And so this is also how FSSC makes sure that there are clear requirements on these topics. And I think what is important is that vulnerability assessment and threat assessment, that they are being performed, and based on that, based on the risks, control measures need to be defined and implemented, and obviously the effectiveness needs to be reviewed. These are the four most important requirements for an effective food defense and food fraud approach. When you want to have more details on that, you can find free downloadable guidance documents on the FSSC 22000 website with much more detail. But I also like to show you that there is the PAS 96. And PAS again is a public available specification, and that is, I think, a very good guide that can support you in developing or reviewing your own food fraud and food defense system. As said, it's a guide, and it is a supportive document. So it's not a document where you can be certified against, but it's a good tool, I think. The hazard analysis and the hazard plan and integration in the management system. Again, where can we find requirements? On top again, Codex. So that Codex is still a great document. I still think that it helped us very much to have the level of standardization in food safety that we have at the moment. So you find the HACCP approach in there, as you obviously know. And then in the ISO 22000, there is one chapter, it's chapter 8, and you find all these HACCP steps and principles in chapter 8 of ISO 22000. And if you look at that, I think it's even more robust than the requirements in Codex. And also a good thing is, of course, it is auditable. It are auditable requirements. And then, as I said, you also find HACCP requirements in most legislations. So what do we see as a good approach? And again, there are more good approaches, but this is, I think, a picture that shows how you can look at the HACCP requirements. First of all, identify your prediction programs. And on the left side, you find documents that can support you to do that, or to review your existing Previctory programs. Then obviously the preliminary steps, defining your products, product specifications, your flow charts, your all the things that you need to do a robust hazard analysis, the intended use, the users of your product. Then you can start with your hazard identification. And you need to identify, as it's called, relevant hazards. And a way to talk about it, it's the hazards that reasonably can occur, reasonably are expected to occur. So you don't need to identify hazards that are absolutely not likely to happen. So it's already a first filter. But also when you have identified them, you need to identify the acceptable level of that hazard in the end product. And that's not always a strong element in systems. So for each of these hazards, you need to identify how many salmonella is acceptable in my end product, or how many listeria, or what about physical contamination? So what are the acceptable levels in my end product? If you do not know that, how can you control it? You need to identify that. And then the hazard assessment starts. And that is, as you probably know, the risk analysis part of HACCP. And there is no methodology that is mandatory, not in ISO 22000, not in other standards. The only thing that is mandatory is that you look at the occurrency, what is the likelihood that the hazard can occur, and you have to look at the severity of the hazard in your end product. So that is a connection to the consumer. And I always say severity, then we talk about contamination, we talk about illnesses, we talk about physical injuries, and in the worst case, people can even die, of course. So it's all about the severity of the hazard in the end product. And that gives you an idea of the risk of the hazard. And risks that are above a defined risk level, and it's up to you to identify it yourself, we call now the significant hazards. And that is a change in the 2018 version of ISO 22000. The word significant was not in it. And I think this makes it more clear. We now have a clear definition of what are hazards and what are significant hazards. Significant hazards are the output of the hazard assessment, and they're all the hazards that are above a certain risk level. And also, what the standard is very clear about is that those significant hazards need to be controlled. There's no question about it. And you can do it in ISO 22000 in two ways. You can do them, control them as a CCP, as a critical control point, or you can control them as an operational Previctory program. And there, ISO 22000 differs from the general principles of food hygiene of Codex, because Codex does not know operational Previctory programs. There's a lot of discussion about what is a CCP, what is an OPRP, and I think this hour will not give you the exact answer. But what is important is they both control significant hazards. That's very clear now. And there are some topics mentioned in the standard. It's called the categorization of the control measures. And that categorization says there are a number of things that you need to consider in your decision if it's a CCP or an OPRP. For me, a CCP is a clear step. It's a clear step in the process. It is things like heat treatment, pasteurization, sterilization. So it's a step defined to control a hazard, to reduce it or to eliminate it, whatever. And the products are fully controlled by that step. And that is possible for things like metal or pathogens. But sometimes we have significant hazards that are not so easy to control. For instance, glass. You can have an X-ray machine, and you can probably define that as a CCP, but not a lot of organizations have that. So a significant hazard like glass is often controlled by a number of control measures, not by one specific step. And in that case, the OPRPs come in. That is a program of control measures that control a significant hazard. But there will be a gray area, and it's up to the HACCP team or the food safety team to take smart decisions in that, as long in the end you make sure that your significant hazards are controlled effectively either by a CCP or an OPRP. And here is, I think, in yellow, exactly that connection between a significant hazard and the control measures. I didn't mention one thing, and that is the validation of control measures. The control measures need to be validated, and there's also a lot of discussion between validation and verification. I come back on that a little bit later. This is, I think, also a picture that explains how ISO 22000 looks at HACCP. You see those preliminary steps and the PRPs as a first block on the left. You have to do the hazard identification, the hazard assessment, and that brings you either CCPs or operational PRPs, the control measures. They need to be validated, looking at the capability of the control measure to control the significant hazard. And there you have the connection with your finished products and the acceptable level in your finished products. You need to make sure that you look at the capability of a control measure, if it will be capable to control that significant hazard according to your definitions in the end product. Then you can implement it, then you can start production, you can bring products into the market, and then we have the verification step. And the verification step is looking at the effectiveness of the system and the effectiveness of the control of the control measures. And that is the performance evaluation, where you look if the system works and where you can have improvement or where you need actions. And in the end, that can lead to modification of your system again. And you will recognize that this is a PDCA. This is a plan, do, check, act cycle. And I think ISO 22000 uses the PDCA in the right way. A slide on validation and verification. Sometimes difficult for organizations to understand. Most important is to ask yourself, what is the objective of both? And I think what is important is the word capability when you look at validation. It's confirming that your control measure has the capability to control significant hazards. That's important. So for new products or new processes, you need to do the validation before your products are in the market, because if you do not look at the capability, you can have high risks. What needs to be validated? Well, all control measures for significant hazards, so the OPRPs and the CCPs all need to be validated. And there's also a when, of course, at the first design, but you can also do it with planned intervals. For instance, you look at your heat treatment, your sterilization process, and you do a validation with planned intervals again to see if the control measure is still capable. And of course, with every change that have a potential effect on food safety. And verification, that's more afterwards. It's a confirmation that your food safety processes in the system is effective and it leads to delivery of safe products. And you need to do it also for the OPRPs and CCPs, but also for the Previctory programs. And you see the difference that validation is not mandatory for PRPs, but verification is. And a very important element is that the output of the verification is input for the management review. And that is the top management looking at the effectiveness of the food safety management system. And there you see how top management is connected with HACCP, because they need to use the output of the verification in their review of the food safety management system. Last but not least, performance evaluation and improvement. Some elements of that. I mean, when we do not look at the performance evaluation and we do not use that as continuous improvement, we have a weak system. And first of all, of course, the monitoring and measuring of the processes itself, the direct monitoring of CCPs or OPRPs, that is a part that you need to use. You need to use at those monitoring results, and you need to see if there is any trends, if anything went wrong. So you need to have a verification on that level. That's the first step. But then you also look at the bigger picture. So if we look at the control of PRPs on the longer term and the OPRPs and the CCPs, what can we learn from that? Did we control them effective? When went things wrong? How can we learn from that? What is the root cause? So that kind of things. And then there's a verification of the total system again. And there you use all kinds of information data like customer complaints, internal audits, external audits, whatever. So that is looking at the food safety system at the highest level. Elements of that verification are, of course, internal audits. It's a very, very strong tool in a food safety management system. I always say, make sure that you have a very good internal audit system with trained internal auditors. Sometimes we do not provide enough resources for that, but it's a very important part of the improvement process. All kinds of analysis of monitoring and verification results. And then, of course, the management review as the highest level where top management needs to look at all that input, and they need to decide, did we control food safety effectively? And if not, what do we need to improve it? And I think a very important part. Corrective actions, come back to that in a minute, but very important to find root cause analysis. And in the end, it's all input for improvement of suitability of the system. Corrective action processes. What we see in practice is very good examples, but also weaker examples. And I think this picture, without really detailing it now, but it shows, I think, the most important steps when there is a non-conformity, what you need to do. And I like to bring under your attention that the first question you ask yourself, do we need to take a direct correction when there is a non-conformity? So, for instance, when we see that the metal detector is not working, we need to stop the line. We need to block products. We need to ensure that the metal detector works again. These are all corrections, direct actions to ensure that we do not have unsafe food in the market. And the next step is looking at the root cause. And I always say it's important to identify both of these steps. And a root cause analysis is not always easy, but you need to have the right people who are involved in the root cause analysis and make sure that you understand the problem. It's very critical. And in the end, if you do a good root cause, then you can define actions to ensure that the non-conformity is not happening again. And then again, a critical and not always a strong element of these processes is looking at the effectiveness of the actions. And sometimes you cannot look straight away at the effectiveness. Perhaps you have to wait until the products are in the market again. But you need to identify how are we going to review the effectiveness of this action. And that is when you can close when everything is okay. Or if you, of course, say it's not okay, you need to go back in this process again. So an example of a corrective action process, a very important tool. Make sure that your people are trained and understand these processes, and make sure that you use it in your own food safety management system. The last topic already for today, food safety for small organizations and less developed food safety systems. When you look at the food supply chain, I think, I know the majority of food organizations are small organizations. And there is a lot of countries where we still need to support food organizations to understand HACCP and to implement it in their system. Those organizations are always not ready to have tomorrow a certificate against one of the GFSI recognized certification schemes, like FSSC 22000. So I really think we need to support them. And a lot of your suppliers, obviously, when you are in food manufacturing or in other food activities, a lot of your suppliers are also those smaller and less and organizations with less developed systems. And you also need to support them to ensure that you get safe ingredients. What I think is great that already a couple of years ago, the Global Food Safety Initiative developed what they call the Global Markets Program. And that is really a capacity building and conformity assessment system for smaller organizations or less developed food safety systems. And they didn't define how to do the assessment. They didn't define what kind of auditors we need or how we can train them. That is happening by the certification owners. And FSSC has also a global markets program based on that GFSI program. And again, I will not go into detail. There's a lot of information on the FSSC website if you want to have more information. But a summary of it is that the minimum requirements for food safety systems are defined. So that's not yet on the GFSI recognized level, but it's Codex HACCP plus some additional requirements. There is a training and capacity building program. So it's possible for organizations to have a good training from training organizations and to make sure that they are supported in their journey to have an effective food safety system. And there's a possibility to have conformity assessments, not certification, but it's a conformity assessment where a qualified and approved assessment body looks at the system and compares it with those minimum requirements. And that can help an organization because they will be listed on a website and it is transparency for their clients that they meet those requirements. And again, it can help them also to have a kind of stepping stone approach towards GFSI recognized certification. They can stay at conformity level or they can go to GFSI recognized certification like FSSC 22000. I provided you the link to the FSSC 22000 website and a specific link to the Global Markets Program. And if you want more information, you can go there. This picture, again, very shortly, shows how Global Markets works. There's a self-evaluation tool, free downloadable on the website of FSSC. So an organization can do a self-evaluation against the requirements. Optional is a training provided by training organizations with a license with FSSC. And then there are two levels that an organization can reach. It's called foundation level with really the minimum requirements for food safety. They can have a conformity assessment against it. Then they get a foundation level conformity statement. Then they can decide, do I want to go for GFSI recognized certification to FSSC 22000? And again, flexibility of the program, they can do it in one step, go directly to FSSC 22000, but they can even do a step in between. We call that intermediate level. So that is a step in between if they just want to have some more time to reach that GFSI recognized level. This is in short how this program works, and I think it is an interesting tool to use for small suppliers or if you are a small organization to use it for yourself. And now I see a slide that tells me that I finished my presentation in 48 minutes, I think, Simon. Not too bad. And I'd like to thank you very, very much. And I'm here to answer some questions.
Okay, yeah, great. Thanks very much, Cor. If you can, yeah, we're back on. Yeah, there are actually, well, there are 430 people on, and there's been a few questions, and the more learned members have been actually answering. But so if you do have a question that hasn't been answered that you've typed in, or you have one while we've got Cor here, let's go for it. This is a rather long one to start with, Cor. This is from Govindasamy. Sir, great presentation for FSSC 22000. Do we need to document the management system? Can we place management systems such as supply chain, supplier control, handling non-conforming products as part of the PRP program? For validation of control measure, please suggest how to validate control measure if it is only visual check. So it's a few questions bundled up there.
Yeah,
Cor. Okay.
That's more than one question, but great questions. First of all, yes, for FSSC 22000, you need to document the management system. But if you follow the requirements of ISO 22000, you will find all the requirements to do so. The elements that I showed in this presentation gives you a flavor, but just go through the ISO 22000. You can do a kind of gap analysis against the requirements, against your own system, and you will find what you need to have a management system in place. If you want to put controls in like supply chain, supplier control, handling non-conformities, you can put it in your prerequisite program. That is possible, but make sure that when you have management system elements like handling non-conforming products, often that's more generic process and generic requirements. because you can have non-conforming products from several sources. So most of the time you need to have identify a process for that. And normally we do not put it on the Previctory programs, because Previctory programs need to prevent that things go wrong. They need to make sure that things are not going wrong. And a non-conforming product, then it already went wrong. So it's a little bit different. But supplier control, supply chain control can all be part of your Previctory programs. Yeah. And there's a question also on validation, I think, Simon.
Yes. Yeah. It's
well, that's interesting. Yeah. When it's only a visual check. Well, a visual check sometimes can be used to control a significant hazard. But then again, the validation is how reliable is that visual check? Because it's looking at the reliability of the control measure and also the capabilities to control the hazard. So you need to ask yourself, okay, I have a visual check. For instance, in slaughterhouses, we have sometimes abscess, how do you call it in English? An abscess or some infection in abscess. Well, you can see them. You can see them. So it's a visual check. But you need to have a trained and qualified associate who knows how to recognize it. So you need to make sure that the reliability of that visual check is on the right level, and that it's capable to control the significant hazards.
And using humans visual check, it's fraught with the infallibilities of humans. They get tired and things like that, or bored, that type of thing.
That's interesting, But sometimes what you see is that validation with visual checks is you do a test. You do a test that you have infected products or you have some wrong products in line, and you test if they are detected. But sometimes you can do it. It's sometimes more difficult. But you need to think about it. How can I do that validation for a control measure for a significant hazard?
Okay, thanks, Co. Next one, Margaret. We are implementing a food fraud program. What resources would you suggest to determine vulnerability risk?
Ooh, great question. We can talk another hour or another day about this. First of all, when you talk about food fraud, most critical is to understand your supply chain, because you can have food fraud caused in your own organization, and people are not happy, or they want to have some advantage. It's perhaps that purchasing manager who likes to have a big bonus, and you know there are sometimes people doing wrong things. Well, that is one part of your assessment, but the very critical part is your supply chain. So first of all, you need to gather information that tells you something. What kind of fraud can happen with my raw materials? Some raw materials, like spices, are much more vulnerable for food fraud, and there are websites for that. You can find all kinds of information. For instance, RASF, that's in, I think, in Europe, an information source on that. So you need to understand your supply chain, and you need to understand what kind of fraud is likely or possible to happen with my raw materials or the things I buy. And you can also look at countries or regions. Perhaps some countries are more vulnerable. So suppliers from certain countries, perhaps you need to have a dish. So identify what are your food fraud risks. And then what you need to do is identify control measures for that. So resources you need is what I say. You need to have, like for HACCP, you need a food safety team. You need to have a food fraud team with people who understand the supply chain, people understanding your own processes, to identify what are the risks in my own organization and in my supply chain towards food fraud. And so people understand these two parts. And then they need to do a risk analysis on it. And yeah, again, just like HACCP, identify control measures for those food fraud risks.
Super, thanks. Very clear. Okay, Dahrani, sir, great presentation. What type of document to be maintained for new requirements, risk and opportunity clause 6.2?
Yeah, this is interesting because this is a big change in the 2018 version of ISO 22000, and we will have, I think, a webinar on it in a later stage, I think, on the changes of ISO 22000, Simon. But to give you a short idea, ISO decided that all the management system standards will have the same template, and that's what they defined the high level structure, without going in detail. But all the management system standards of ISO, ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and now also ISO 22000, they have the same template and partly the same content. And it makes it easier to have an integrated management system covering not only food safety, but also covering quality, environmental risks, etc. When you look at that risk and opportunity clause 6.2, it is important that an organization identify what are my business risks and business opportunities. That's what I said already. And those business risks and opportunities are what is happening in the world on food safety, what can harm me, what can happen, or what is positive for us in a development. New techniques, new technology, perhaps we can use it. Yeah. So horizontal scanning, looking in the world, opportunities and risks. From there, it's expected, and that's in chapter 6, that you need to do a risk analysis also on those opportunities and risks. And for the higher risks, you need to identify countermeasures again. So if there is a possibility that there are certain things happening in the world that can harm your processes, you need to identify that. And again, you need to do a risk analysis, and you need to identify countermeasures on the higher risks and opportunities. So it's a HACCP approach a little bit, but then not only for your own processes and for the food safety hazards in your processes and raw materials, but it's more on a business level. It's a business level risk analysis.
And how often would you do that? Is that something that's part of the annual planning, annual review, or is it, obviously if something comes up that's a significant risk during, the year, but would you see it as like it being like annual or something?
Yeah, at least you can do it annually. You can have a planned interval for it, but I would say make sure that there is a kind of continuous scanning of the things happening in the world. I mean, I remember that a very long time ago we had the BSE event, the BSE scare. And I know that there was a producer in Holland of baby food or children food, and there was meat in it. And before that the real scare broke out, they already identified, because there were some publications, there were some researchers, and they said, well, it might go wrong there, and they already decided to use another raw material from another region. So you cannot prevent everything, Simon, but I would say try to have a process in place that you are looking at what's happening in the world, and then of course you cannot wait for a year to review this system. You need to do it directly when significant changes are happening.
Yeah, great. Peter Elias, great presentation. When you refer to validation, do you mean this has to go through a similar validation process as is done in the life sciences industry using GAMP5? Is there any automated system involved in the process?
This is very, very specifically and technologically. I don't know exactly what kind of system.
The next question actually, because Vikash has asked, could you please tell me an example of a validation and verification? Sometimes it creates confusion. So can you give a simple example of a validation and a simple of a verification?
Yeah, when you do, for instance, let's look at a significant hazard, the contamination with pathogen microorganism. Yeah, that is a significant hazard, and you have a CCP, you have a pasteurization or sterilization process for that. You can imagine that. So when you validate that control measure, the control measure is the heat treatment. That's the control measure. When you validate it, you look at the capability of that heat treatment process to make sure that your end products, the acceptable level of pathogens in your end products, meet requirements. So you do a test run, for instance. You are not bringing the products in the market yet. You do a test run. Things you like to know is, for instance, when it's a batch sterilization or pasteurization, that the temperature in all the pasteurizer is everywhere the same. When in some place the temperature is 10 degrees lower than in the other, you might have an issue. So you need to do tests about the temperature, the deviation of temperature. You do some test runs where you take samples and you do analysis of the products to see if the products meet the acceptable level in the finished product. So you do all kinds of tests to see if that countermeasure will be capable to control that significant hazard. So it's really looking in at advance. So that's an example of validation. When you look at verification of that countermeasure, again, the same countermeasure, you do it afterwards. You look, okay, I did a validation. I think that everything is okay. I think it's capable, but you didn't start producing yet, So verification is then the confirmation that you did a good validation and that your countermeasure was effective. And that you do based on experience, on data. You can look at customer complaints, as I said. You can look at your internal audit process. Was it also controlled every day, every week? You can look at laboratory analysis. So it's the confirmation that the countermeasure also was effective. So I think these are hopefully two examples of validation, looking at the capability of the countermeasure, and verification, looking at how effective did we control the significant hazard.
So that's good. Yeah. So validation is before, verification is afterwards. And validation would be if you've got a new processing, a new line, new equipment, new products, changed product.
Absolutely.
And right. Okay. Hopefully that's clear. That's a question that's asked a lot, that Cor. Christina, what is the most appropriate decision tree?
Yeah, this is a difficult question. I think the Codex decision tree is a good basis. The only thing with the Codex decision tree is that we miss the OPRPs, that other way to control significant hazards. I don't think there are a huge number of decision trees. I think my advice will be first decide how you want to develop your system. Do you want to follow only the Codex approach, or do you want to follow the ISO 22000 approach, where you have the OPRPs? And then I would say make sure that your decision tree meets that flow chart that I showed, and make sure that you identify your hazards, identify your processes, and then for all the significant hazards, and that is what you do in your hazard analysis, make sure that you find the process steps where that hazard can occur or can be eliminated, and make sure that you build a countermeasure in place to control it either as a CCP or an OPRP. I cannot recommend one decision tree. FSSC doesn't have one. And I know there are a huge number around. Most important is that they contain the steps that I try to describe.
Okay. I don't think we can let you go without having a go at this question from Kathleen. Thanks for this webinar. Can you please detail the difference between the control measures OPRP, operational prerequisite procedure, and CCP, and the methodology for identifying the right control measure?
Yeah. I already tried to explain that it's difficult, most difficult part, I think, of ISO 22000. But I think first of all, realize yourself that when you have identified your significant hazards by doing that hazard analysis, for all significant hazards, you need to have a control measure in place. And there are two ways to control it. That's most important step: CCP or OPRP. You cannot control a significant hazard with a PRP, with your Previctory programs. You have to control it as an OPRP or a CCP. And then you need to use your common sense, and you also can use some text in the ISO 22000 that says, look at what kind of hazard it is. The categorization of control measures in CCPs and OPRPs, one of the things that, as an example, you can look at is how high is the risk when my control measure fails? You can imagine when you have a very high, so you have to do you can do a kind of risk analysis on the failure of your control measure. So when you have a control measure that is high likely to fail, the likelihood of failing is very high, and also the severity when it fails to the consumer is very high. And then you can think about, well, perhaps I need to have very strict control on that, because when the likelihood that my countermeasure fails and the severity to the consumer is very high, well, a program of a number of countermeasures is perhaps not robust again. So it is looking at the kind of hazards, the likelihood that it occurs, and also what happens to the consumer when the countermeasure fails. And based on that, you need to define the good countermeasure. My best way of explaining is examples. As I said, metal, you can control it with the metal detector. All the products go through it. You can identify it as a CCP. Glass, yeah, if you do not have a glass detector or an X-ray machine, you have to have a number of control measures. So a combination of control measure is often an OPRP, but there is a gray area. And my biggest message is make sure you control the significant hazard. And yeah, if you call it OPRP or CCP, it's good to try to do the best. But if you sometimes make some mistake in that, I think that's not most important, as long as you have an effective control measure in place.
That's great, Cor. I think on that note, we'll end it there. We have run over a little bit, but obviously very interesting presentation, lots of engagement from the audience, lots of questions. So thank you very, very much on behalf of everybody here today. Lots more people will see the recording, and from myself and the IFSQN. Cheers, Cor.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you all for joining and listening. I wish you good luck with everything, and bye-bye.
Thanks. Right, ladies and gents, I've loaded the certificate in the sidebar, the certificate of attendance. You will know you have to download it from Dropbox. You can either print it and sign it yourself or open it in an image editing package such as Microsoft Paint and type your name. We can't personalize them for you, unfortunately, just don't have the time. So there you go. There's a certificate in the sidebar. Thanks again to Cor Gronfeldt from FSSC 22000 for that great presentation. Cor will be back at Food Safety Live in a few weeks, and we'll be letting you know about that shortly. Okay. Thanks for your attendance. Thanks for your input. You make it what it is with your questions, or else it'll just be me and Cor. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the rest of your Friday, and we'll see you soon. Take care.